So let's get started. Welcome everyone to our fifth webinar that we are hosting on the EU HTA regulation. My name is Chantal van Geels, with 20 plus years of experience in medical market access, HR, and real world evidence, and I'm currently leading the Evidence and Value Hub here at SSI, and we're really supporting our early value and access thinking and its specific evidence generation across Europe and US. And in the context of today, providing end-to-end support with JCA applications, especially working with biotech companies, and delighted to have the fifth webinar around now. So little mini recap, the EU HTA regulation that comes with a mandatory submission of a joint HTA dossier that is assessing the relative effectiveness and safety. That is 1 year in now. And in this webinar, we will be focusing on its application and strategy, especially for biotechs. And I think two key features and challenges that we have been calling out for a long time now is that the timelines of this mandatory submission are fixed and run really in parallel with the EMA regulatory assessment timelines. And the scope for this assessment is determined by the HTA assessor, so not by yourself, and is expressed in PICOs. A reminder, it stands for Population, Intervention, Comparators and Outcomes. And these determine what kind of analysis you need to be presenting in your JCA dossier. And the final PICO scope will only be communicated around 100 days before you actually have to submit your dossier. And it's potentially much broader than you may expect. So, well, that's a quick summary. And this far, we have seen that around 14 JCA dossiers were submitted for assessments. And although no outcomes have been published yet, we know it's been challenging for companies. And I attended the EPA, the Evidence Pricing and Access conference the past few days, and it was interesting because a lot of the presentations were around this JCA and the JC and some experiences. And what really was interesting to me that there was this Nicole Jurgen. She had been able to interview 5 manufacturers of JCA. What you would say the first JCA club of the manufacturers that have JCAs currently in the procedure. So I'm happy to share some of her insights and the key takeaways from these interviews at the very end of this webinar, so that we have those insights too. Well, it's for sure pretty heavy lift, and it requires accelerating evidence and value conversations earlier than many biotechs typically do and expect. And so we are here to discuss today our early learnings and hopefully provide you with useful strategies to optimally prepare this in a manageable and feasible way. And I'm very excited to have Mel Walker with me here today for this discussion. And I'm going to give him the floor now. But before I do that, I really would like to welcome everyone to share any questions in the chat, in the meeting chat that's open for you. And we will make sure we take sufficient time at the beginning to cover them, at the end, sorry, to cover them before we close. So Mel, over to you.
Thank you, Chantal, and I'm excited to be here too. Thank you very much for inviting me onto your very popular webinar. So my name is Mel Walker. I'm a strategic advisor to biotech companies. I run a couple of companies, Access in Vivo and Biopharma Futures. I've spent over 20 years in global and European market access leadership roles for larger companies. I've sat on global R&D and business development decision-making boards. And although I've held a number of broader commercial roles operationally in Europe, my patient access is really my passion, and it sort of remains my sort of core area. And I've spent a lot of time helping companies to really think through how they prepare for launch, but also more importantly, how they think about sort of upstream, what they should do in clinical development to meet the needs of HTA and payers. And particularly relevant to today, as I've been involved in a couple of big efforts. One was the effort to bring EMA and HTA parallel scientific advice to get that established, and that's obviously something a lot of companies use now. Also, my company Access in Vivo focuses on providing global HTA and payer scientific advice to small biotech. And then last but not least, I was involved in the very first UNETA relative effectiveness assessment pilot, which was a long time ago. But as we know, that was the sort of precursor to JCA. So I really feel like I've been into this from the start, which is nice to see. It's sort of nice. It's exciting to see it evolving now into what it is. Um,
Yes, finally.
exactly after 13 years, I think it's been since that first pilot. Um, but you mentioned a couple of things I'd like to pick up on, which really emphasise why this is such an important conversation today, particularly for small biotech. And I think you use the words heavy lift, and I think this is absolutely a heavy lift. It's a lot of work. It requires significant budget. And the reason for that is because it brings forward a lot of these activities that could previously be sequenced. And so these sort of two elements of sort of the scale of the work and the sort of timing of it have really taken small companies by surprise. And so, I think actually when you look at large pharma, they've sort of been relatively well prepared for these things. But for small biotech, I would say it's down to three things. One is sort of limited access capability. And I'm not just talking about having people who understand access, but the technical requirements of JCA are an upgrade on what we've had before. The second thing I think is around budget constraints. They're taking care of clinical development and regulatory activities. Almost having this as a big add-on is quite a lot, and so I think that's the second thing. But the third thing, and I just want to spend a bit of time on this, is that I think it's the mindset, and you might find this sort of a bit familiar to you that many companies, not large companies, small companies, still have this idea that market access is something that you can shift out downstream to after the regulatory approval. And so while those of us working in access have always known it should be in at the very start, even actually, I mean, I've done work for large companies and thinking about where you do your preclinical work, where you invest there focused on global payer requirements because it's so important. But now market access is sort of no longer optional. It's no longer downstream. It's sort of mandatory and it's synchronous with this regulatory process in Europe. So it pulls forward all of this work, and it's like I think it's like an elephant. Some people talk about eating an elephant. How do you do it in multiple bites? And we used to be able to do that with market access. You could do sequence the HTAs and do the work for those like that. Now you have to do it all in one go, and eating this big elephant in one bite is tough. And I think that's a much bigger operational shift for small biotech than they've accounted for, particularly in the context of this limited capability and resources. I do think there's a silver lining. I'm an optimist. I think there's a silver lining here because while it might not change the sort of outcomes for large pharma because they're already doing all of these things, I think this enforced early preparation for small pharma or small biotech companies, because this activity underpins the value and everything you do in the national processes. I think it will actually result in an uptick in access performance for some of the small companies because it is now something that has to be done and done robustly early. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And because I don't think the total scope of what you ideally would do or should be do in to secure market access across Europe, that hasn't changed, right? It's more that it's the upfront work and it's the level up a little bit where basically everything has been the level of the assessments and the scientific rigor has gone up to the level of the most rigorous countries. And that's that's a challenge. But the activities and also the thinking has always been important and has been detrimental to companies when completely overlooked. So I'm actually very excited about the fact that now the JCA is a very visible thing on the horizon, on a regulatory horizon, on the regulatory timelines. You can see it. It's embedded in the milestones, and it really pushes that earlier discussion and earlier preparation. And I anticipated, or I was that would happen, or I was hoping for that to happen. And actually, at least in the companies that I've been working with in the past year, we actually see that this is happening because, companies are very focused on regulatory approval, very focused on the regulatory milestones and all the things that need to be done in order to get there. And then they and typically regulatory affairs people are then triggered by that JCA piece that is also appearing there.
Mm.
and they are then, internally knocking on the doors like, what is this? What do we need to do? We realize we have to do that parallel submission. We have to be ready for JCA as well. How are we going to do that? Because for all of these people, the timelines, regulatory timelines are critical, right? That's the value at that time often is very much connected to the time to regulatory approval in Europe and across the rest of the globe. So I really like that triggering and that and at that stage often there is an opportunity for pivotal trials to be optimized and to say what are other needs, etc. What remains very hard though is the prioritization. How much weight should we give it right now? Well, we are in the midst of preparing for regulatory approvals, especially FDA, and also it has to do a lot with the ownership, right? Because this is a new thing that traditionally clinical development has not really been thinking about so much. It was indeed a later, more commercial access problem or ownership, and it's still so. But there is and that ownership play and maybe even switch. I think especially when it comes to relative effectiveness, it's very clinical, right? It's all about clinical evidence, and I really do think that it's good to think about it from a most medical clinical perspective. Informed by, of course, those experts that know how downstream is being used. So, and that's what you see. Who's holding the ring? Who's now taking that responsibility for this piece that has nothing to do with economics, that is purely clinical or a relative effectiveness, and who's gonna start preparing for it? And it's quite a cross-functional effort, but it hasn't pretty much played out yet. How?
No,
So yeah.
it's funny when you talk in my old roles in sort of larger pharma companies, cross-functional working was such a key feature. It was almost a skill set that you needed to have in order to work in large companies. And so, whereas it's strange with smaller companies, it's definitely a whole range of different types of range of different sort of functional competencies have been taking sort of the lead on this. It can be regulatory, it can be clinical development, chief commercial officers. It's really interesting how in small companies it's different people stepping up. And I think it's interesting if we look at some of those early the sort of first wave of companies, it's majority large companies, isn't it? If you take large cap being over 10 billion, then you've got the sort of AZs, Pfizer, Amgen, but even the sort of the smaller big companies, Ipsen, Jazz, they're still big organizations. Whereas we've only got a real small handful of the smaller companies, Iovance, Precigen, maybe 3 or 4 of these smaller companies. And I think these are the ones that are going to sort of face the most challenge. I mean, one interesting thing to note is actually we heard about the letters of intent. Do you remember there was a webinar on the topic about, sort of 50 or 60, I think it was close to 60% being delayed. And actually some of those being delayed or majority being delayed by 2 months or more. So this tells you actually that it is really hard, to meet these requirements alongside the sort of regulatory process. But if you take those numbers and you sort of think, well, the small companies are only a third of the sort of wave, then actually it's some more significant size companies too that are struggling with this systematic coordination between regulatory and sort of this start of the HTA process. So they're clearly having a challenge, and I think that is because of the front loading of the requirements, but also because of the resourcing, because all this needs to happen at the point when they're preparing their regulatory submission. And one of the things that I've noted in my career is that even larger companies struggle, for example, with regulatory resourcing. So we often see, don't we, that the FDA submission goes in as the priority, and then the EMA submission maybe 2 or 3 months later, even for large companies. And that's because there's this internal capability that then needs to be redirected towards the next regulatory submission. So if they're already struggling with that sort of resourcing, then if you add on this, which is another, and it does, you said it's highly clinically oriented, it requires the clinical teams as well as the regulatory teams, as well as people working in access and all of these different biostats, HUR, these type of capabilities, then this capacity constraint is real, isn't it? Because it's on top of everything else. So,
Absolutely.
so I think that's going to be a big challenge, and we're seeing that it's a big challenge from the letters of intent and those delays there.
Yeah, and then indeed, yeah, if we look then at the other opportunity we have, I mean, little experience with because it's only 1 year in, but there is the opportunity to have the joint scientific consultation, right? And that's the other important component
Mm.
of the HTA regulation that we also now starting to see first experiences. I don't know, how about you in your experience there so far?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you rate, I mean, JSD is such an important topic. I mean, it's, I'm a firm believer in HTA scientific advice, and I, use this throughout my career to really drive, positive change in organisations to address the requirements of global payers. But um, with JSD, it's a bit of a challenge, isn't it? Because there's a very limited number of slots. And when I think about how small biotech tend to prepare for these type of things, you have to be ready to when the slots open, you have to be ready to make sure you're getting the slots. So there's a timing piece. There's the preparation that goes into that, the briefing book, and quite rightly, small companies do prepare well for these type of engagements, like they prepare well for regulatory engagements. Um, but it requires intensive resources, internal bandwidth, preparation. So I think they're going to struggle a little bit with that. Even if they do get one of the limited slots. But then I also think, and you'll be familiar with this, whenever you go to an HTA and ask for advice, you get a laundry list of things that they would like you to do. And sometimes it's not really clear what the most important things are. So you have to really take that away and sort of prioritize and say, well, these are the things that are going to have the most impact and prioritize those. So I think smaller companies will struggle a bit with that prioritization. And then there is this bit around, and you will have had it before. Should we go for HTA advice? Because if we do, then we'll have to justify. If we decide not to take the advice, we'll have to justify that. And that is a kind of real risk. I get that, but at the same time, I prefer to know. So I had a chance of making some decisions that improved, the situation I was in than to not know at all. So it's always, in my view, it's always better to get advice than not get advice.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have the opportunity, I think it's important to get it. But like you said, you want to be a bit mindful about that advice, right? So what I struggled with a little bit this year is that the moment that I often came in is at the moment that there's already like a clear path forwards to prepare for EMA scientific advice, for example. And at that stage, you kind of need, if that's the first moment you start thinking about, oh, what about JCA or what about the JSC? Should we do it or not? Or what are the JCA implications? That is, I mean, it requires quite a bit of thinking and, thinking about what would be your positioning from a patient or market access perspective in Europe. What is the consequence from a, current standard of care perspective, outcome? So basically, it's not an advice. You go in blind, right? And also, in order to avoid the laundry list, it's so very good to think upfront about strategically how to shape that advice and how to avoid basically asks that are completely outside of your boundaries of what you can do. So I think there are great parallels in how you approach or should approach ideally a JSC versus an EMA scientific advice, with being highly strategic even on the type of questions you do ask or you avoid asking, because you don't want. So and this requires preparation, and then and of course, briefing book requires preparation. So it's depending on the feasibility at that stage, it makes a lot. You only want to do it if you can get a good advice, I would say,
Mm.
and then in an ideal world, you want to be early enough to get that good advice, because then I think that's the best starting position. Also, from a what will my pico scope look like likely, and how does the assessor look at that in my area? So I think it's a great opportunity. But I've had some challenges this year, even when biotech were very ambitious on wanting to have it in. We really pushed that prep work in a very squeezed window, which is fine, we can do that. And I think were some amazing journeys where we were so going fast forward in order to make that happen, because you want to do all the prep work upfront, and it's not just the prep work; it's about the internal alignment. About how are we going to position, and what can we say, what can't we say, what can we promise. So it's really, the good thing though is that all that work and all that effort that you would put in a briefing book, even in a JCA briefing book, even if you, sorry, JCSC briefing book, even if you don't really know whether you will even be granted that advice, these are the right discussions that you should have anyhow in your company. So basically, it's the right, if you want to understand what do I need to do in order to get my head around the JCA, well, that's the typical prep work that you would do for a JSC. So I think great opportunity, but the earlier you have a visibility on that this needs to happen and you are willing to start thinking about that, the easier it is and the more options there are. And so I think we can go earlier even than that we are considering now. And then, of course, we're also supporting quite a lot of companies who are well underway in their phase 3. And then the options are limited, right? But yeah, there are things probably that you can do. And well, I'll let you elaborate a little bit on that, because I know you have a lot of experience in the area.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I just want to underscore something you said that was so important. You talked about the preparation for the scientific advice. Almost that is that is the exercise
Yeah.
itself. Because almost the advice that you go for. Um, you know, sometimes, dare I say it, that working in market access, we might already know a number of the answers that the HTAs might come up with.
Yeah.
Sometimes that going for the scientific advice externally focuses and drives that engagement with the content and really helps bottom out the strategy in a way that nothing else quite works in the same way. I mean, and so it's actually a bit because of with Access and Viva, I designed this scientific advice process with a briefing book. It's using sort of leading ex-decision makers from US and Europe. But I really did it in that way because I knew that first part of the process was so important. And so you can do that if you do JSC, that takes 4.5 months from the point that you have the briefing. But we're trying to compress this into 2 to 3 months so that it's
Yeah.
really streamlined, risk-free, and can be done quickly. So that's one option. But there's other options. People run payer advisory boards. I sit on a couple for large pharma of those, and sometimes you can do some through those. I think it's sometimes I think that payer ad boards don't quite go into the sort of level of depth and detail that you need to get to real concrete evidence recommendations and priorities, but at least it can help. So there are things you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And at least if you want to understand your picoscope, right? Especially in rare disease and cell and gene therapy, it just may already be the best idea to just make sure you understand the guidelines, you understand the provider or the physician perspective, and you also um, oh, you're back, Mal. You're blacked out for a minute, for a second. But and I was saying that you talking to clinicians is very informative as well, right? Especially not necessarily around the evidence, but definitely around what is important to them, because ultimately that trickles down to what is important from a payer perspective as well.
Mm.
So I really think that. I mean, we've talked about the pico prediction and the preparation work in order to get your kind of plan ready. And what is interesting, and also I've experienced, classically, like the HR people, they are typically the ones, who know what it takes, right, to then do all that extra evidence generation outside of the pivotal trials. And but typically in biotech, there is no HR group on the ground yet, right? So it's like, okay, yeah, we know what to do. How can we write the dossier? And I thought, well, there's a big gap in between. That is the evidence generation, and that takes, I would say, in principle, pull out at least 1.5 years, right? In order to prepare for the evidence, is doing literature searches, is thinking about your evidence framework. Do I need to do real evidence? So it's a lot, and we're going to go all into details. But the thing is, again, it's something to not underestimate what needs to be done, and which is also challenging to not to get too overwhelmed, right? Because the dossier writing is a beast on itself, but the evidence generation piece, I mean, big pharma have big teams. They know that they have to do it anyway, so why not earlier? It's just front loading of budgets, and they typically tend to do it anyhow early for some key markets like UK and Germany, for example,
Yeah.
right? So nothing new on that horizon except from that dossier that they're carrying. But the FGen part is sometimes even something that is not done at all by a biotech, because they are pushing that out. So I mean, I think it starts with optimizing your pivotal trial where you can, because that's the real deal. It's not about changing things upside down, adding many more arms, or making a clear situation where you have to do a single arm single arm trial. Now, making it an RCT with 3 treatment arms. That's not at all the purpose here. I think it's about optimization of your trial to, include some parameters, include some outcomes that are very important, and then indeed understand what is the rest, and then prioritize there, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would just, I think it's really important for particularly for small companies to realize. I think there might be a fear of getting, sort of payer input, because it's going to lead, to lots of things that need to be changed, and that's going to add lots of costs. It's going to sort of distract the organization from the sort of, the core mission. But the reality of it is that when we're changing trial design parameters, there should be a very clear business case. It should be, we're going to make these changes, and this is going to be the positive outcome from making those changes. And I think it's also important to, and you were sort of referring to this, it's not always big changes, not always multiple arms. It's sometimes some small tweaks can make the difference. It could be, I don't know, adding thinking a little bit more carefully about your endpoint, or adding a measure that might be valued by payers, not changing the number of visits or anything like that, just adding a measure. Or it could be slightly, prolonging the follow-up duration, so it's a little bit longer follow-up, or tweak.
Yeah, and to that point, Mel, I'm now thinking about it. I was just about to say that the unpopular statement to have a longer follow-up, right?
Yeah,
That's in general pretty, because regulatory approval in Europe, is typically done at the earliest moment possible from an EMA perspective,
yeah,
and that is not always the right timing from an HTA perspective. But first of all, I see that there's some convergence there, but
yeah,
also. Uh, Typically then market access takes years as
yeah,
well, right? Even that unpopular thinking, should we consider a longer follow-up? Should we maybe push it out a little bit, and at the advantage of speeding up in the market access space? I think that these are real considerations that companies should be doing when they are setting these priorities, right? And it could
yeah.
be that there's a clear no, but it's definitely a consideration.
Yeah, and just sort of, I mean, whether these sort of small tweaks can make a big difference without actually risking clinical feasibility, or your clinical risk. So I think they should definitely think about that. One of the things I really, sort of the ostrich strategy, putting your head in the sand, is something that we should never do. And so I think, knowing what you need to do and making informed trade-offs, even if you can't do everything, that's fine. Just pick, it might be you only make one or two changes, but that's important. And I think all of that also applies to the sort of JCA strategy approach, as well as to evidence generation, because we know that these costs are going to be substantial. It's probably, mid six figures is not going to be unusual for, when you think about all the work that goes into a JCA, and probably some of the larger companies are spending upwards of $1 million on this. That wouldn't surprise me at all, because you've got the real world data, you've got systematic literature reviews, ITCs, writing the dossier. So, as you said at the beginning, it's a big lift. But the biggest swing factor here is the number of picos, and so that's what everyone is sort of struggling with that. So if you're budget constrained, you can kind of really think about choosing a small number of high quality picos, then at least you're going to have a good sort of platform on which to build once you come to national pricing and market access. So in some ways to do that, focusing on the most guideline relevant comparators and maybe having a look at how guidelines might emerge, current standard of care, what's most established, what might be the sort of key emerging standards of care in the space, but making sure you go for the ones that are really likely to emerge and not the others. Patient reported outcomes, but things that are really relevant to payers. Sometimes payers say, we want this, but actually then they discount it. But if you choose something that's really relevant, that might be important in your PDCOs. And then this this wouldn't be popular with the JCA team. I know that, but high volume markets, picking where you're going to get most of your patients is an obvious way to prioritize. Of course, in the PICO scoping, they blind it because they don't want you to do that. But if you haven't got enough resources to do all of them, then you have to select somehow, right?
Yeah, and I fully agree. If you do a few analysis really well,
Mm.
two ITCs with the core, then you can kind of, I mean, and of course, this is not how big pharma is supposed to do it, right? So they try to capture everything but if you have to kind of choose your battles, doing a few things right, and then infer based on external evidence without doing all the, just based on, what we have seen or what someone else has already published, to infer some of the other analysis I think that's a wise strategy because at least you show that you have some critical evidence done well.
Mm.
And in terms of prioritization, I even think that, we've talked about how do you do it at the critical ones for the big markets. You can also think, for example, I'm working on a cell and gene therapy in quite a competitive space with a big standard of care. But there, already, safety is going to be an important factor. So maybe you should really make sure you know already that everyone, the view will be, it's all the same, but the safety. So think about where is the biggest risk. And so I really think that these conversations are good. And then, of course, connect to maybe if you're very US focused, then think about what is most meaningful. What can I use in the US as well, for example, because that's the last topic I think we wanted to tip upon is that it's not an isolated European JCA party, right? It's about early market access and early patient access thinking, global early thinking, that then informs your strategy. And so a wider perspective is definitely a good prioritization way as well.
Yeah, I mean, and this is exactly why with Access and Viva, I set it up as global scientific advice. I didn't want to, of course, a number of companies saying, well, we can use that for JCA, and so, but for me, the US is still the dominant market. The pharma, it's 50 to 60% of global revenues. And in small biotech, I would say that dominance is even greater. There's an even greater focus on the US, as you've kind of indicated. So, but if you think about, there's already been evidence demands, there's always additional evidence demands from Europe already. JCA will probably increase those evidence demands further. But the way I see it, the additional demands for differentiation that European payers ask for, you don't tend to get those same asks from the US market access team. They tend to sort of say, well, we can make, the FDA package is fine for us. But what I've noticed consistently in my career is if you give the US team a differentiated evidence package based on what Europe might be asking for, then they increase their forecasts and sometimes pretty dramatically because differentiation drives value. It drives the ability to push the price higher. It drives the ability to reduce payer restrictions, increase HCP adoption. And so all of those things push it up. So I think companies should be justifying evidence generation and that then supports things like JCA by having a clear path to Europe, but also increasing US revenues too. So I think that's one really important global sort of
Yeah,
thinking
and
through.
what I heard at EPA was also interesting because it's a very international, globally oriented conference, and I've seen people calling out PICOs like as the not in the context of JCA, but just in the context of where do you need to steer? Which PICOs are important from a global access perspective? That was an interesting take, and then another one that. It's always about what is the impact? What is the impact if you don't do it well, or what is the impact if you ignore the whole JCA, and how much? And what I really liked is that the statement that it's actually a starting point now that is very visible because it's published, and it sets an anchor to the payer perception, right? It's not so even you can talk about the formal impact and we yet to be seen, but
Yeah.
it's a perception, and that perception is reaching outside of Europe as well. It's reaching the UK, it's reaching US and outside. So I think that is because it's like a very tangible dossier, which is well as assessment of the evidence on market access relevant materials. So yeah, I
Mm.
think it's very important to connect those dots.
Well, and
Um,
I'd say there's a couple of other things around that sort of the global piece is, so if you think about this pulling forward of the sort of start of the HTA process in Europe and that need to do comparative effectiveness work early. And then you sort of think about the US, which normally launches first, and you've got the AMCP dossier. Before, the AMCP dossier was quite, in companies, it tended to be quite separate from the European work because that was sort of sequenced and later. Now it's sort of being pulled forward. You can see that these two processes are starting to overlap. So actually, and they do require, you might have different PICOs, supporting the different dossiers, but depending on what's being used. But you can see there's an opportunity to really, sort of gain some efficiencies by thinking about these two simultaneously now, and again taking more of a global perspective. So that's one thing. Then the other thing I wanted to touch on was really about because it's very very relevant to small biotechs is sort of BD. Um, so I think we talked about already that small companies had tended to think that they could leave this work till downstream, and leave it to the partner. And actually, even pre-JCA, one of the reasons I decided to work with small biotech was because I sat on this global BD decision-making board, and we were looking at small biotech companies and what they were doing, and with a view to in-licensing their assets. And on so many occasions, I saw that the sort of payer evidence gaps hadn't been filled appropriately, and they didn't even have a plan to deliver those things either. So you end up with this situation where they weren't really able to sort of support what they were doing appropriately when they were coming into those deal negotiations. So sometimes that meant we didn't do a deal at all. Sometimes it meant that we ended up taking geographical rights, so we might take the US rights, but not the rest of the world. Sometimes actually the pricing they had was just unachievable because they hadn't underpinned it with the right evidence. So the
yeah.
deal value was significantly reduced. Whereas if they had done this work early, so I think that all of that is kind of what I guess we've seen. But with JCA, I've heard similar noises. Can we leave this to the partner to do? Can we sort of push this off? And while that might be some of the activities, if you're sort of really early, might be possible to push off to the partner.
Yeah, and if you are success, I have seen that we did quite an early thinking around the PICOs, and then indeed the partner was able to take over, and everyone was kind of relieved. It does happen, but it's all about being on track, right? So I think, and you, if also in terms of those budgets and investments, heavy investments, they come ultimately at the end, right? It's the last year, and even the most heavy investments is the 6 months or a year before your pivotal data phase 3 or whatever it's your pivotal come in, and then all the efforts to make it until regulatory approval and then the JCA. That's the
Yeah.
big massive effort. But before, like during phase 2, early access thinking, making your plan, understanding your needs, see what low-hanging fruit you can capture into your pivotal trials, that is the lower lift investments.
Yeah.
That is the budget-wise, resource-wise. And if you miss out on that because you think the whole thing is too overwhelming, it's too much,
Mm.
then you're not on track. You don't even sure you can't even communicate that you have thought about all of that, that you have pressure tested all of that. So if you just do that smaller investment, even before you start going all out in evidence generation, if you can even try to push that out to the max, but you have a plan. You have a plan. You have an understanding, and I think that is, and you can communicate that for your future partner, that you have your roadmap and that they can take a plan with them to execute upon without thinking. And I think that's value and that's being on track.
Totally. And I always say that, even if you can't afford to do the work, if you've got the plan and you're going into BD discussions with that clear plan, so you know what the HTA risks are and you know how to overcome them, then that definitely contributes towards a better negotiation. So I often say to companies, having a strong JCA strategy is about negotiating leverage for your European component if you are going to partner, but it's also strengthens, as we talked about already, the global payer narrative. So it makes you think about how you strengthen that part too.
Exactly.
So it has a sort of double benefit, if you like. Um,
Hey, Mel, before I don't know, I don't know whether you had something very pressing to say, but I want to be mindful of our time. And
yeah, thanks for the question.
I, I think just before we go to questions, I promised that I would give some key takeaways that I heard from those five manufacturers who actually are doing the procedure. And what was interesting that a lot of these things I think we have been emphasizing already because that feels naturally, but still. Uh, Interestingly, one of the key takeaways, think holistically and don't separate JCA from broader market access strategies. So that was one of the three key to-dos. And then another one is start early and
Mm.
make use of JSC when possible, which is interesting because none of them did had the opportunity to do JSC, obviously. But yeah, but that's what they state, all of them. And very important, break down the silos because it's a super cross-functional effort. And I think this is particularly large pharma speaking because they are typically operating in silos. And the critical silos to break down were mentioned: regulatory, biostats, HOR, and clinical development. So no access commercial, it's really all the evidence generating bodies that need to work in sync. And that was a very important thing. And then to save energy, interestingly, today, not invest too much on your HCP and patient engagements because that's today. I think there's work to do for full implementation. It's just a questionnaire that is. So I think for now, don't be too worried about that. It will probably be more important in a couple of years, not today. Then the other one is avoid heavy governance. Make sure in that process when you have your MAA and your JCA and you get requests for extra analysis and read runs or label changes, alignments, all these done, you have to be quick and you have to be able to be quick without waiting. And the number one challenge, obviously, was PICOs, be able, focus, it's a central puzzle. So take efforts to predict your PICOs well. That was important. Be mindful of the label gap because if your label has a risk to change, and I think regulatory affairs people know pretty well what the risk is and what the label scenarios could look like. If that's not set in stone, or there is risk, it trickles down. It has an impact. So that the label gap may change your PICOs ultimately in a very late stage. So be aware of that. And I really like the fact that everyone sometimes tends to think about population intervention, comparison outcomes, and isolation, but actually it's combined. With one type of population or subpopulation, typically have only few sets of comparators that are really important, and another population has only this comparator. So it's not about picking a couple of all these points. No, think about what is the PICO, and then you can reduce it when you prioritize. So I thought that was really interesting thinking that I'm definitely, going to apply even more when working with clients. So yeah, I think shall we move to the questions?
Yeah, I've just seen that there's a note here on our chat to say ask people to send questions to the Q&A as opposed to the chat. So that was
We have, I think we have quite a bit. Oh, we have quite a bit of things in the Q&A, so that's nice.
Hmm.
Um, shall we just, I don't know whether you can also open there, but I think we have quite some questions in the Q&A at the moment. So that's where apparently people were able to put their questions in, not in the chat. It's always a surprise to me, every webinar. So one of the questions is, can you explain how the physician perspective influences the payer perspective? And are physicians consulted by payers as part of the process? And my first answer, and I'll let you speak, Mel, is I would say the least competitive, or the more rare, the or the most innovative, where there's not like a set a clear precedent from other formal HTA assessment where it was clear this is how payers like to position and this is where reimbursement fit. If it's like a cell and gene therapy that is quite new and it's quite difficult, I think then this is where payers with limited clinical backgrounds typically heavy look at clinicians to help them position it at the right place for the right population. And there is where physicians are highly influential.
And I do think, Jane, when I think about payer populations, is they aren't clinical experts. It's always interesting, like even when I've been engaged, when I've been engaged as a sort of payer expert on things, there's often like an expectation for you to be a clinical expert, which you're not, right? You understand how payers work, but and I think payers are the same. They, even when I'm working with senior decision makers, you have to brief them heavily on the clinical context. So I think that's what really the reliance is. Payers rely on physicians for the clinical context, and so that's important. I'd say there's also something to think about here related relation to JCA is that actually if you're talking about rare diseases, whoever you consult may then because there's quite a heavy conflict of interest process around JCA, and whoever you consult may then be not sort of engaged in the JCA process as an expert. So particularly thinking about that around maybe clinicians pay patient organisations too. That's something to think about. But yeah, I just sort of see payers are expert on how the system works and reimbursement, but they rely on clinical expertise.
Yeah, and I think this connects very well to the second question that I think we can quickly take, because it's some companies found it that their PICOs are more broader than expected. Others have found that it's more practical. And when can where does the uncertainty come from, right? And I really think that if you look across Europe, for example, or across the globe, and there's a very big heterogeneity in treatment patterns and treatment guidelines, then it becomes more tricky, right? Because then really the JCA, the HTA assessors try to be representative as much as they can, and then something that may be completely irrelevant for country A may be highly relevant for country B. If you have the idea that this could be the case for your drug, which is the clinicians that can more easily confirm that with you, to speak to the first question.
Yeah.
If that's your understanding for the European market, well, then it's again the strategy. Do you want to focus yourself on the obvious and on the largest markets? But you can at the risk that some of the unexpected will be asked because of that broad diversity.
Yeah, shall I pick up the next one? We're a series.
Yeah.
I'll read it out so people know. We're a Series B company with a phase 2 asset and a small regulatory team. When should we realistically start building JCA readiness, and who should own it internally? I think this is this is exactly where a lot of clients are at today. So I think that's it's good that you're at that stage. So you're in the key window, as like Chantal and I have been talking about today, when you can actually start to have the opportunity to consider some tweaks in your trial design. And that could be some of the tweaks we talked about. It could be even as simple as just designing your study so it's more amenable to indirect treatment comparisons. I know that's something that's important. So I think that's the first thing. So yes, now is the time. engage and sort of have an opportunity to shape the evidence you're generating, but also think about your longer term evidence plan for JCA while you've got enough time to do it without it being sort of crunched into your preparation for your regulatory submission. So it's great you're there. Who internally should own it? Now, I don't know, we might differ a bit on this because I think when I worked in large pharma, I used to use the term that patient access is a mission, not a function, because I'm someone who hates silos and sort of really, just thinks the organisation should be working together. It's so damaging if they don't work together effectively. But so I wouldn't necessarily call out a specific function here, but I would say it is important to have a specific person in the company who's sort of accountable, to taking this forward. Now that person should have, good forward planning and project management capabilities, but also should be really good at internal engagement and influencing. Because there are some, you really need to kind of get a team of people working together and contributing to this mission.
And now I also do have maybe a little bit of a provocative opinion on that, because me being a medical doctor by training and then moving into health economics, so basically on both spectrum of all the HR, health economics and outcomes research, I sometimes feel that that when it comes to writing these type of dossiers, the real writing is and the ownership is best to be done ultimately by someone who has deep clinical knowledge, as well as that that the epidemiology background in understanding the how you actually create that relative effectiveness and this, because ultimately it's and it comes down again to your global value dossier as well, and that a clinical part and the clinical part of your and whole JCA being clinical. It needs to make deep sense. It needs to be very connected to the pivotal trial, to the regulatory. It's not just a technical exercise with doing all these analysis and then you just dump that on a sheet. It's the so what, and sometimes you have high uncertainty, but it means nothing because the context is such and such. And I really think that I would love to see a little bit of a switch. Having clinical development teams and medical affairs teams that are connected and with regulatory, having more deep knowledge about epi and different study types beyond pivotal trial, but beyond the RCTs, etc. And then and really being able to take all of that and then before economics comes in, basically.
We haven't necessarily seen, in my experience, like I know that sort of the regulatory lead might become aware of it. It's not necessarily being picked up and led by the regulatory person. They're not sort of grabbing hold of this area.
It's FGen, right?
Yeah, and then the other thing is I've had chief medical officers, chief commercial officers, taking the role within the company of driving this forward, and I think it's I do agree with you in terms of the content and how the dossier should be put together. But one of the chief commercial officers I work with, is very good at bringing the right people in and sort of recognizing the experience in the team and making sure that experience goes into doing the right things and not sort of putting obviously it wouldn't be appropriate to have a heavy marketing spin, for example, on a dossier.
Exactly.
You know what? Even going back to my years ago when I was doing NICE submission, I've realised that actually having the commercial marketing people in the room at the same time as the clinical and medical people,
very, very important. There cannot be a disconnect.
Yeah, but what you found, you end up taking sometimes you can be too conservative in how you position something.
Exactly.
It's still a human reading the dossier, so sometimes having that little bit, well, let's not push it to say something that we can't support, but can we put it in a bit more of a positive context here rather than it being a bit flat and make it more readable? So I do think it does come down to the sort of individuals and their skill sets.
Mel, I'm very mindful of time, and I see two questions that I know I can answer just by this great talk of Nicole and these interviews. So there's the last two questions. First, any advice on conflict of interest requirements, and should we be mindful on HCP patient engagements and boards? Yes, and no. So conflict of interest has been flagged as an nearly unworkable beast at the moment. There is the guidelines on the websites of the EU yeah, in the Commission. It's very stringent, very difficult, especially if you are rare disease. It's nearly impossible to bypass. And then on the other hand, we see today that the engagement that is formalized into the JCA process with patients and physicians is rather limited to a questionnaire and not like truly embedded inputs. I think both things are likely not going to make it like as today through the 2028 evaluation, but this is today's situation. So I think that for today, I would really prioritize you creating that relationship and getting the insights from your patients and your providers, and not to worry too much of that conflict of interest, which will happen, but then the use of it is relatively limited. So that will be my take based on what I've heard so far. And the last thing is here, have companies been able to push back on PICOs that were not relevant? The only thing have learned yesterday or day before yesterday is that there is this PICO scope meeting, right? So you get your scope, and then there is an opportunity to discuss this with the HTA assessors, to discuss your scope. I've not heard about pushing back on PICOs. I don't think it has been pulled out, but the HTA, the manufacturers have found these discussions tremendously helpful, very constructive. They felt heard, and they said it was really a collaborative approach. So I can imagine that that's me filling in, but I can imagine that for those highly concerned PICOs that they say, well, we keep it part of the scope because that's what we do, but we hear you in terms of how we assess that and how the weight we put on those because it's less relevant or really not possible. So I really think that for me the positive scoping meetings mean that there is some leverage there, but even if it would not be pushed out completely.
Mm. Jeremy, do you want to try and pick up this out licensing question?
Yeah, quickly, and then now you can close if you want.
Planning for
So maybe a good closing remark after that.
You mentioned JCO prep can affect deal valuation. How specific do partners get in the due diligence around HTA readiness? Well, I think the key thing is actually in due diligence, partners dig in a lot more into comparators, endpoints, and evidence gaps, and particularly for versus European standard of care. So I think it's really important to understand this and the gaps that you have. If you do have payer evidence gaps, then that will result in sort of discounted European revenues. So I think that's important to note. In fact, in some deals, you now find the milestones being pushed out beyond regulatory milestones to reimbursement milestones because those are the milestones which are considered to be more impactful on commercialization. So that's now happening in deal structure. And just remember that if you have a credible strategy for JCA and you've really thought about these things, then you're going to be better prepared. You've got a roadmap, you know how to overcome these issues. That will definitely give you a stronger European negotiating position and global position because hopefully you will have thought about the US at the same time from a comparative effectiveness perspective too. So yeah, that was that question.
Yeah, I think let's close. I think
it's worth asking if people have other questions, can they send them through?
Yeah, absolutely. So if there's any more questions, just drop us an email. We are happy to continue, folks. Continue to share information wherever. So absolutely no barriers there. Well, we appreciate that you all stayed for the full hour. We spoke a lot. We hope it was really helpful. We found it very exciting to be able to work together and do this with you or for you. So yeah, hope it was useful and looking forward to collaborating with you.
Yeah, thanks for a great discussion, Chantal. Good to see you.
Thanks, Mel. Bye bye.